The fortune was built on blood. Cornelius Vanderbilt did not earn his money through innovation or brilliance. He took it, ripped it from the hands of weaker men who hesitated, who showed mercy, who believed in fairness. He believed in nothing except accumulation. By the time he died in 1877, he had amassed $100 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is over $200 billion in today's currency, a fortune that rivals the modern empire of Elon Musk. Wealth so vast it wasn't just money, it was distinct economic sovereignty. He didn't just own trains, he owned the arteries of American commerce. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the richest private citizen in American history, and he was a monster. He started with nothing, a Staten Island ferry boy who could barely read. He bought his first boat at 16 with a loan from his mother, $96. He paid her back within a year and bought 2 more boats, then 10, then 50. He undercut competitors until they bled out. He bribed officials. He manipulated stock prices. He destroyed rival shipping companies by flooding routes with his own boats at unsustainable prices until the competition collapsed. Then he raised his rates and claimed the monopoly. His competitors called him ruthless. He called it efficiency. But the railroads made him a god. In the 1860s, Cornelius shifted from ships to trains. He purchased the New York Central Railroad and began acquiring every competitor within reach. He built an empire of steel and steam that connected the entire eastern seaboard. His trains moved faster, his rates were lower, his profits were obscene. Rival companies tried to fight him. He crushed them without hesitation. When one competitor attempted to sue him for anti-competitive practices, Cornelius looked him in the eye and said the words that would define his legacy. "I won't sue you. I'll ruin you." He did. Within 6 months, the man's company was bankrupt. His assets were seized. His family was destroyed. Cornelius bought the wreckage at auction for pennies on the dollar. This was not business. This was warfare. And Cornelius Vanderbilt never lost. He lived like a peasant. Despite his fortune, he refused to spend. He wore the same coat for years. He lived in a modest brownstone in Manhattan, while other millionaires built palaces. He ate simple food. He drank cheap whiskey. He hoarded every dollar like a dragon guarding gold. Money was not for spending. Money was for accumulating, for proving dominance, for winning a game that had no finish line. His children learned to fear him. Cornelius had 13 children. He despised most of them. His eldest son, Cornelius Jeremiah, was an epileptic gambler. Weak, disgraceful. Cornelius cut him out of the will almost entirely, leaving him a trust fund that barely covered his debts. His other children received small bequests, pocket change compared to the empire. The bulk of the fortune, $95 million, went to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. The only child Cornelius believed was competent enough to handle the weight. But even William was given a warning. On his deathbed, surrounded by family he did not love, Cornelius grabbed William's wrist and rasped his final command. "Keep it. Don't let the fools spend it." He died hours later. The fortune passed to William, and William obeyed. He doubled it, turned 100 million into 200 million within 8 years. He was careful, strategic, ruthless in his own right. He built monuments, Grand Central Terminal, palatial mansions on Fifth Avenue, but he never forgot his father's warning. Keep it, protect it. Don't let the fools spend it. But the fools were already being born. William had 8 children. Unlike his father, he loved them. He gave them educations, opportunities, freedom. And that freedom was poison. The third generation of Vanderbilts did not know struggle. They did not know hunger. They were born into wealth so extreme, it had lost all meaning. Money was not something you earned. It was something that appeared, infinite, eternal, a river that never ran dry. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born in 1862. He was William's youngest son, shy, bookish, fragile. While his brothers pursued business and politics, George pursued nothing. He had no interest in railroads, no interest in expansion. He studied art and languages and architecture. He traveled Europe and collected rare books. He was a dilettante, a dreamer, everything his grandfather despised, and he was very, very rich. When William died in 1885, He split his fortune among his children. George received $10 million, approximately 300 million in today's currency. He was 23 years old. He had never worked a day in his life. He had no skills, no experience, no understanding of how money was made. He only understood how it felt to spend it. The psychological shift was instant. The Commodore had built the fortune through deprivation, through saying no, through hoarding every dollar and letting it compound. George had never been told no. He had never been denied anything. The money was not a responsibility. It was a toy, a tool for building the life he imagined. And what George imagined was a house. Not just any house, a monument, a palace that would rival the chateaus of Europe, something that would prove the Vanderbilt name belonged among royalty. He began searching for land, somewhere remote, dramatic, a location that would amplify the grandeur of his vision. In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina. The town was nothing. A small mountain settlement with dirt roads and wooden buildings. Isolated, humid, surrounded by dense forests and the Blue Ridge Mountains. Most wealthy families were building in Newport or the Hamptons. Coastal, accessible, fashionable. George chose Asheville specifically because it was not fashionable. He wanted isolation, wanted to build something so remote that reaching it would feel like a pilgrimage. He began buying land, parcel by parcel, farm by farm. He purchased 125,000 acres, an area larger than the city of Philadelphia. The transactions were quiet, anonymous buyers, shell companies. The locals did not realize what was happening until it was too late. Their ancestral farms were being swallowed. The land consolidated into the hands of a single man who had never stepped foot on most of it. But the land was hostile. The soil was depleted. The forests were overlogged. The previous owners had strip-mined the timber and left the earth barren. Erosion was rampant. Streams ran dry in summer. The winters were brutal. This was not prime real estate. This was damaged land. Land that would require millions just to restore. Any reasonable person would have walked away. George hired an architect, Richard Morris Hunt, the most famous architect in America. Hunt had designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was the architect for the American aristocracy. George told him the vision, a French Renaissance chateau modeled after the castles of the Loire Valley, something that would dwarf every mansion in America. Hunt listened, calculated, then warned him. A house of that scale in this location would be financially catastrophic. The cost of materials, the cost of labor, the cost of transporting everything to the middle of nowhere, it would be ruinous. George did not care. He was not building a house, he was building a legacy. Proof that the Vanderbilt name could create beauty, could fund art, could rival the old families of Europe, who looked down on American wealth as vulgar and new. This house would be a cathedral, a shrine to taste and culture and the belief that money could buy immortality. Hunt began drawing the blueprints. 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, 43 bathrooms, a banquet hall large enough to seat 60 guests, a library to hold 20,000 books, an indoor pool, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, elevators, central heating, electricity throughout. The house would span 178,926 square feet, 4 acres of floor space, the largest private residence ever built in America. The numbers were insane. Construction began in 1889. George hired over 1,000 workers, stonemasons from Europe, craftsmen from Italy, carpenters, plumbers, electricians. A private railroad spur was built just to transport materials to the site. Limestone was quarried in Indiana and shipped in by the ton. Marble from Italy, oak from Europe. The estate required its own brick factory, its own woodworking shop, its own electrical plant. The scale was industrial, not residential, and it devoured money. The initial budget was $2 million. Within 2 years, it had doubled, then tripled. George kept approving expenses, more fireplaces, imported tiles, custom chandeliers, gold leaf, stained glass windows designed by hand. Every room was a showcase, every detail was excessive. He was not building a home. He was building a museum to his own taste. And museums do not generate revenue. They only consume. But the horror was just beginning. The land itself fought back. The soil was so poor that George hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, to rehabilitate the estate. Olmsted brought in botanists, agronomists. They planted thousands of trees, imported soil, built irrigation systems. The reforestation alone cost hundreds of thousands, and it would take decades to mature. George was spending millions to fix land that should never have been purchased. The workers began to whisper. Accidents on the construction site were constant. Men fell from scaffolding. A stonemason was crushed when a block of limestone slipped. Another worker disappeared into the woods and was never found. The locals claimed the land was cursed, that the mountains did not want this house, that building something this arrogant in the wilderness was asking for punishment. George ignored them. He visited the site obsessively, watched the walls rise, the towers take shape, the house growing like a tumor on the mountainside. It was hideous and beautiful, grotesque in its scale, a monument to ego disguised as culture. And every brick, every stone, every imported chandelier was another wound in the family fortune. By 1895, the house was nearly complete. The cost had reached $6 million. Adjusted for inflation, over $200 million. George had spent a fifth of his inheritance on a house he would barely live in, a house with no purpose except to exist, to prove that he could build it. But the blueprints were a death sentence, because maintenance was only beginning. Heating a house with 65 fireplaces required constant labor. Staff to manage 250 rooms, gardeners for the grounds, security, repairs. The estate required an army just to keep it functional, and it generated nothing. No income, no productivity, just cost. Endless, compounding cost. George Washington Vanderbilt, too, had built the most expensive house in America, a chateau in the wilderness, a monument to the belief that beauty justified bankruptcy, and the house was hungry. The construction site looked like an invasion. In 1889, the forest outside Asheville, North Carolina, was gutted. Trees that had stood for centuries were felled in days. Stumps ripped from the earth by teams of horses. The land was flattened, scorched, reshaped. George Washington Vanderbilt II was not building a house. He was declaring war on the landscape itself, and the landscape would lose. Over 1,000 workers descended on the site. Stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from Germany, bricklayers from England. They arrived in waves, speaking different languages, carrying tools that looked medieval, hammers, chisels, saws that required 2 men to operate. This was not modern construction. This was craftsmanship. The kind that took time, the kind that bled money, and the money bled immediately. The first problem was logistics. Asheville was isolated. No major roads, no infrastructure. The nearest railroad station was miles away through dense forest. Transporting materials was impossible. So George built his own railroad, a private spur line that connected directly to the construction site. 3 miles of track, custom built. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars just to move limestone and marble and oak from trains to the foundation. But that was only the beginning. The house required materials that did not exist in North Carolina. Limestone was quarried in Indiana and shipped south by the ton. Each block weighed thousands of pounds. They arrived on flatbed cars, dozens at a time, and were unloaded by cranes built specifically for this project. Marble came from Italy, shipped across the Atlantic, transported by rail. Dragged up the mountain by teams of oxen, the logistics were insane. Every brick, every tile, every piece of glass had to be moved through a supply chain that spanned continents. George hired Richard Morris Hunt as his architect. Hunt was a genius, also a realist. He warned George that building a French chateau in the Appalachian wilderness was financial suicide. The design required precision, symmetry, materials that could not be sourced locally, labor that did not exist in the South. Hunt estimated the cost at $2 million. George agreed. The budget was a lie from the start. The blueprints were monstrous. 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, 43 bathrooms, a banquet hall that could seat 60 guests beneath a 70-foot ceiling. a library designed to hold 20,000 books, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, servants' quarters large enough to house an army. This was not a residence. This was a small city. And cities require infrastructure. The house needed its own power plant, its own water system, its own sewage treatment. George hired engineers to design it all from scratch. They built a reservoir in the mountains to supply fresh water, installed pipes that ran for miles underground, constructed a heating system that required coal deliveries by the trainload. The estate became self-sustaining out of necessity, because nothing this absurd could rely on the outside world. But the house was hungry. Every month, the costs escalated. The initial $2 million budget evaporated within the first year. George approved additional funding. Then more. Then more. By 1891, he had spent over $4 million, and the house was only half finished. The walls were rising, the towers were taking shape, but the interior was empty. Just stone and Kong space, and the echo of hammers that never stopped. The workers began to die. Construction accidents were constant. A stonemason fell from scaffolding and broke his back. He died 3 days later in agony. A bricklayer was crushed when a limestone block shifted during installation. His body was removed quietly. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, just another casualty in the construction of beauty. The workers whispered that the house was cursed, that the land rejected it, that building something this arrogant in the wilderness would summon punishment. George did not care about curses. He cared about details. He visited the site almost daily, walking through half-finished rooms with Hunt, pointing at walls that were not quite straight, ceilings that did not align perfectly. He demanded perfection. Every fireplace had to be unique. Every room had to tell a story. The craftsmanship had to rival European palaces. If a carved panel was flawed, it was torn out and redone. If a tile did not match, the entire floor was replaced. Waste was irrelevant. Only the final result mattered. The landscape was reshaped to match his vision. George hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, to turn the barren estate into a garden. Olmsted arrived and immediately understood the problem. The soil was destroyed. Decades of logging and farming had stripped it of nutrients. The forests were gone. The streams were polluted. This land was dying. George told him to fix it. So Olmsted did what gods do. He created from nothing. Thousands of trees were imported. Oaks from Europe, pines from the Pacific Northwest, exotic species that had no business growing in North Carolina. They were planted in patterns that mimicked natural forests but were entirely artificial. Olmsted designed roads that curved through the estate like veins, built stone bridges over streams that had been rerouted, created vistas that framed the house from specific angles. The landscape was not natural. It was theater, and theater is expensive. Olmsted's work added another $1 million to the budget. Soil was imported by the ton. Irrigation systems were installed. An entire nursery was built on site to propagate plants. Gardeners were hired permanently. Not for a season, forever. Because maintaining this artificial Eden would require constant labor. The estate was not just a house. It was an ecosystem that required feeding. But the house was still rising. By 1893, the exterior was complete. The chateau stood 4 stories tall, with towers that pierced the sky. It looked like something ripped from the Loire Valley and dropped into the Appalachians. Limestone walls, slate roofs, Gothic spires. The architecture was flawless, stunning, and utterly out of place. It dominated the landscape like a predator, beautiful and wrong. The interior was where the money really disappeared. George wanted every room to be a masterpiece. The banquet hall was modeled after a medieval castle. The ceiling was 70 feet high, supported by carved beams imported from Europe. A pipe organ was installed in the wall, custom built. It cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. The fireplace was large enough to roast an entire ox, not decorative, functional, because George wanted the option. The library was his obsession. He designed it himself. Walnut paneling covered every wall. The ceiling was painted with murals. 2 spiral staircases led to a second-floor balcony lined with bookshelves. The room could hold 20,000 volumes. George began filling it immediately. He purchased entire collections, rare manuscripts, first editions, books in languages he did not speak but admired aesthetically. The library was not for reading, it was for displaying wealth disguised as intellect. The bedrooms were equally absurd. 43 bathrooms meant almost every bedroom had private facilities, unheard of in the 1890s. Each bathroom featured custom tilework, imported fixtures, hot and cold running water, a luxury most Americans would not experience for decades. George's personal bathroom had a bathtub carved from a single block of marble. It weighed over a ton. Installing it required reinforcing the floor and hiring specialists for a bathtub. But this was the mistake that killed them, because every detail, every upgrade, every imported chandelier was another wound in the fortune. George had inherited $10 million. By 1895, he had spent $6 million on Biltmore, over half his inheritance, on a house. A house that generated no income, no productivity, just cost. Endless, accelerating cost. The staff requirements were staggering. A house with 250 rooms required an army to maintain, maids to clean, butlers to serve, cooks to prepare meals, groundskeepers to manage the estate, security to patrol the property. George employed over 80 servants permanently. Each one required salary, housing, food. The annual operating cost of Biltmore exceeded $250,000. In today's money, over $8 million per year, just to keep the lights on. And the house demanded more. Heating 65 fireplaces required constant labor. Coal had to be delivered weekly. Wood, chopped and stacked. Each fireplace consumed resources like a living thing. The pipes froze in winter despite the heating system. Repairs were constant. The roof leaked. The stonework cracked. The house was only a few years old and already falling apart. Because building something this large, this quickly, meant cutting corners. Meant prioritizing appearance over function. George moved in on Christmas Eve, 1895. The house was not finished. Entire wings remained empty, furniture had not arrived, paintings were still in crates. But George wanted to celebrate. He invited family, a small gathering. They walked through the enormous rooms and their voices echoed. The banquet hall felt cavernous. The library felt like a museum. The bedrooms felt like hotel suites. Cold, impersonal, beautiful but sterile. That first night felt wrong. George lay in his bed in a room larger than most houses. The ceiling was 15 feet high. The fireplace roared, but the heat did not reach the bed. The corners remained dark, cold. He could hear the house settling, creaking, groaning. The sound of stone and wood adjusting to temperature changes. It sounded alive, breathing, waiting. He could not sleep. The silence was oppressive. In a house this large, sounds did not travel normally. Footsteps disappeared into carpet. Voices were swallowed by space. You could scream, and no one would hear. The isolation was architectural, designed into the structure. George had built the largest private residence in America, and he was alone inside it. The house had won. It stood complete, gorgeous, a monument to taste and wealth, and the belief that beauty justified any cost. But it was not a home. It was a mausoleum, a tomb built for a living man, and the fortune that built it was bleeding out. $4 million remained of George's inheritance. The house consumed $250,000 annually. Simple math revealed the truth. Biltmore would eat the rest within 16 years. And there was nothing George could do. He could not sell it. No one could afford it. He could not maintain it without bleeding money. He could not abandon it without admitting failure. He was trapped, imprisoned by his own creation. The house had become a parasite, feeding on the Vanderbilt fortune. Growing stronger as the family grew weaker, the monster was alive. And it was still hungry. The parties were magnificent, and they were lies. George Washington Vanderbilt II opened Biltmore to guests in 1896. The elite came in waves. Industrialists, politicians, European aristocrats touring the American wilderness. They arrived by private train car, were driven up the winding estate roads in carriages, and when they saw the chateau rising from the mountains, they gasped. This was not America, this was a fantasy. A French palace, transplanted into the Carolina forests. Impossible. And yet, standing before them in limestone and slate, The banquet hall hosted dinners for 60 guests. The tables stretched nearly the length of the room. Crystal goblets caught candlelight from chandeliers that hung like frozen fireworks. 7-course meals prepared by French chefs. Oysters from the coast. Pheasant from the estate. Wines from cellars that George stocked with vintages older than the country. The guests ate beneath a 70-foot ceiling, while a pipe organ played music that echoed through the stone like a cathedral mass. They praised George for his taste, his vision, his cultural sophistication. They did not see the bills, because beneath the beauty was a machine that devoured cash. Every dinner cost thousands. The staff alone was crushing. 80 servants living on the estate full-time, maids, footmen, cooks, groundskeepers, stable hands, each one requiring salary, housing, meals, uniforms. The annual payroll exceeded $100,000. In today's money, over $3 million just for labor. Before accounting for food, coal, repairs, taxes, insurance, the house consumed everything. Heating was a nightmare. 65 fireplaces required constant feeding. Coal deliveries arrived weekly by the ton. In winter, the house burned through $500 of fuel per week. The fires roared day and night, and the rooms still felt cold. Because the ceilings were too high, the windows too large. The house was designed for beauty, not efficiency. Heat escaped through every crack. The staff wore layers even indoors. Guests complained about the chill. George ordered more fires lit, more coal burned, more money incinerated for comfort that never came. The bachelor's wing was where the secrets lived, a separate section of the house reserved for male guests. Bedrooms, a smoking room, a billiard hall, ostensibly for privacy, actually for depravity. The parties that happened here were not recorded in estate logs. No formal dinners, no society pages, just wealthy men drinking whiskey and smoking cigars and doing things that required discretion. Women were brought in quietly, not society wives. Working women, dancers, actresses. The kind who understood that silence was part of the transaction. The staff whispered but never spoke openly. They cleaned the rooms the next morning, found champagne bottles, opium residue, stains on sheets that required discreet disposal. The bachelor's wing had its own entrance, its own staircase, designed for secrecy, for men who believed their money purchased not just luxury, but immunity. George hosted these gatherings reluctantly. He was not a libertine, but he understood that power required performances. That keeping the right men happy meant tolerating their vices. And the vices were expensive. The liquor alone cost fortunes: rare scotch, French champagne, absinthe imported before it was banned. George kept the cellars stocked because running out would be humiliating. Weakness, a sign that the Vanderbilt fortune was not infinite, so he ordered cases that went unopened, bottles that aged in the dark while the family bled money upstairs. But George was not alone in this tomb. In 1898, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She was from old money, not Vanderbilt-level wealth, but respectable, educated, cultured. She spoke French and Italian, had traveled Europe. Exactly the kind of woman who should thrive in a French chateau. Except Biltmore was not a chateau. It was a monument to loneliness disguised as grandeur. Edith arrived as a bride and immediately understood the trap. The house was too large, too cold, too empty. Rooms sat unused for months. Entire wings remained dark to save on heating costs. She walked through corridors where her footsteps echoed, and no one answered. The staff were ghosts, trained to appear only when summoned, to vanish the moment their task was complete. She could go hours without seeing another human face. In a house with 80 servants, the isolation was architectural. Biltmore was designed to impress visitors, not to house a family. The bedrooms were separated by hallways that stretched for hundreds of feet. George's suite was in one wing, Edith's in another. Privacy, they called it. Loneliness was the truth. At night she lay in a bed surrounded by carved mahogany and silk wallpaper and felt like she was sleeping in a museum. Beautiful. Dead. Untouchable. She tried to make it a home. Edith redecorated, hired designers to add warmth, softer furniture, brighter colors. She opened unused rooms, hosted teas for local society women who arrived nervous and left overwhelmed. She started a school for the children of estate workers, built a hospital in the village, tried to justify the obscene wealth by spreading fragments of it to the community. But the house consumed faster than she could give because the money was running out. George had spent $6 million building Biltmore. $4 million remained of his inheritance. The annual operating cost was $250,000. Simple math revealed disaster. At this rate, the fortune would be gone in 16 years, and that assumed no unexpected costs, no major repairs, no economic downturns. Just the baseline bleeding of maintaining a house that should never have been built. George tried to stem the loss. He opened sections of the estate to forestry, hired Gifford Pinchot, the father of American conservation, to manage the land sustainably. The idea was revenue, timber sales, a productive estate. Pinchot implemented scientific forestry, selective logging, replanting. It was visionary, also insufficient. The income from timber barely covered the cost of managing the forest. Biltmore was not a business. It was a black hole. Then came the first knife wound. In 1913, the United States government passed the 16th Amendment, federal income tax. For the first time in American history, the wealthy would be taxed on their earnings. The rates started small, 1% on incomes over $3,000, 7% on incomes over $500,000. But the Vanderbilts were not earning income. They were sitting on inherited wealth, which meant their money was slowly being taxed out of existence. George's accountants delivered the news. The new tax laws would cost him tens of thousands annually, and the rates were rising. Congress was already debating increases. 5%, 10%, 15%. The government had discovered a new revenue source, and they would bleed it until it ran dry. This was the beginning of the end. Because Biltmore was not generating income, it was consuming capital. Every year, George pulled from the principal to cover costs. And now the government wanted a cut of what remained. The fortune was being attacked from two sides. The house from below, the taxman from above. George tried to adapt, sold assets, liquidated stocks, cut staff where possible. But you cannot cut 80 servants to 40 without the house collapsing. The gardens would die, the rooms would rot, the illusion would shatter. Edith watched her husband age rapidly. The stress carved lines into his face. He stopped hosting parties, stopped traveling, spent his days in the library surrounded by books he no longer read. The house had become his prison. He could not sell it without admitting failure, could not maintain it without bleeding the fortune, could not abandon it without betraying his vision. He was trapped inside his own monument. The staff noticed the decline. Orders became erratic. Cost-cutting measures reversed days later. George would fire a gardener in the morning and rehire him by evening. The pressure was breaking him. He began drinking. Not socially, privately. Whiskey in the library after Edith went to bed. The servants found empty bottles hidden in desk drawers, behind books. He was drowning, and the house was the water. Edith tried to help, suggested selling parts of the estate, reducing the land holdings, closing unused wings. George refused. Biltmore was his legacy, his proof that the Vanderbilt name meant culture, not just money. Destroying it would mean admitting his grandfather was right. That beauty was a waste, that only accumulation mattered. But the Commodore was dead, and his warnings were echoing through marble halls. In 1914, George traveled to Washington, D.C. for business, managing the estate from a distance, dealing with timber contracts and tax attorneys and the endless machinery of keeping Biltmore alive. He felt ill, stomach pain, persistent, worsening. He ignored it. Vanderbilts did not complain about pain. But the pain did not care about pride. His appendix ruptured. Emergency surgery. The doctors worked for hours. The infection had spread. Sepsis set in. George Washington Vanderbilt II died on March 6, 1914. He was 51 years old. He had spent 18 years living in Biltmore. 18 years watching his fortune bleed into a house that gave nothing back. The news reached Edith by telegram. She was alone in the chateau, alone in 250 rooms, alone with 80 servants who avoided eye contact because they did not know what to say. Her husband was dead, and he had left her a financial time bomb wrapped in limestone and slate. The estate was worth millions on paper, worthless in practice, because who could buy it? Who could afford the purchase price and the maintenance and the staff and the taxes? Biltmore was unsellable, a monument that had become a curse. Edith walked through the empty banquet hall. The pipe organ silent, the fireplace cold, the table set for no one. The house was still beautiful, still breathtaking, still the largest private residence in America, and it was eating her alive. The annual costs had not stopped. The staff still needed salaries. The coal still needed purchasing. The taxes still needed paying. George had left her approximately $2 million. At current expenses, that was 8 years. Maybe 10 if she cut ruthlessly, then nothing. Bankruptcy. The humiliation of losing the Vanderbilt estate, the tomb that her husband built and died maintaining. She stood beneath the 70-foot ceiling and understood. The house had won. It had consumed George's inheritance, consumed his health, and now it would consume hers, unless she did something the Vanderbilts had never done. She would have to fight back. But the house was stronger. The house was patient. The house had time. And Edith was running out. The world collapsed in 1929, and the Vanderbilts were still throwing parties. Cornelia Vanderbilt, George and Edith's only child, had grown up inside the Golden Tomb. Born in 1900, raised in 250 rooms, she learned to walk on marble floors, played hide-and-seek in a house so large she could disappear for hours. She had private tutors, European trips, debutante balls in the banquet hall, where orchestras played and society women wore gowns that cost more than cars. She was American royalty, and she was suffocating. The house was a prison dressed as a palace. Cornelia understood this earlier than most. The weight of Biltmore was not just financial, it was psychological. The expectation that she would marry well, produce heirs, continue the dynasty, maintain the estate, perform well for a world that was beginning to stop caring. She saw her mother aging under the pressure, saw the staff shrinking, saw rooms closing, the slow retreat from grandeur into survival. In 1924, Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil, British aristocracy, a younger son with a title but no fortune, exactly the kind of match Vanderbilt women were supposed to make. The wedding was held at Biltmore. The banquet hall filled with flowers, champagne flowed. The pipe organ played. The photographs appeared in newspapers across the country. America's princess marrying European nobility. A fairy tale. The reality was darker. John Cecil had no money. The British aristocracy was collapsing under the same pressures as the American. Death duties, income taxes, the erosion of inherited wealth. He brought a title and nothing else. Cornelia brought a crumbling estate and a fortune that was bleeding faster than anyone admitted publicly. The marriage was not a merger. It was two sinking ships lashing themselves together. They tried to make it work. Cornelia and John lived at Biltmore, managed the estate, hosted events, attempted to turn the house into something profitable. They opened sections to tourists in 1930. Not the entire mansion, just a few rooms. Controlled tours. The humiliation was staggering. The Vanderbilts had built Biltmore to prove they belonged with European aristocracy. Now they were charging admission like a circus. The tours were marketed as cultural education, a glimpse into refined living. But everyone understood the truth. The family was broke. The house was eating them alive. And they were selling access to their own tomb just to pay the electric bill, because the costs had not stopped. The Great Depression destroyed what remained of the fortune. The stock market crash of 1929 evaporated investments overnight. Vanderbilt holdings in railroads and real estate became worthless. The timber operation at Biltmore collapsed. No one was buying lumber. Construction had stopped nationwide. The forest that was supposed to generate revenue became another expense. Trees growing silently while the family bled money. Edith tried everything. She sold land, thousands of acres. The federal government purchased 86,700 acres in 1916 for $5 per acre. It became Pisgah National Forest. The sale generated $430,500. Barely enough to cover 3 years of operating costs. She sold more land to the state, to private buyers, piece by piece. The estate was cannibalized. The 125,000 acres George had assembled shrank to 8,000. Then, 5,000. The kingdom became a tract. The empire became a yard. But the house remained. And the house was the problem. You could sell land, you could sell art, you could liquidate stocks and bonds and timber rights. But you could not sell a 250-room chateau in the mountains of North Carolina during the Great Depression. There was no market, no buyers. The house was worthless, not because it was ugly, because it was too beautiful, too expensive, too absurd, a monument to an era that had died. The staff was cut ruthlessly, from 80 servants to 40, then 20, then 12. Entire wings were closed permanently, furniture covered in sheets, fireplaces left cold. The house began to rot from disuse. Pipes froze in winter because heating unused rooms was too expensive. The roof leaked. Water damage spread. Mold crept up the walls. The marble floors cracked. The house was dying. And there was no money to save it. Cornelia fled in 1934. She and John moved to England, officially to manage his family's estate. Actually, to escape. She could not stand Biltmore anymore. The silence, the decay, the slow humiliation of watching tourists walk through her childhood home while photographers documented the wreckage. She left her mother to manage the collapse. Edith was 62 years old, alone in a house that had killed her husband and was now consuming her daughter's inheritance. The tourists increased. By 1935, Biltmore was fully open to the public. Every major room, the bedrooms, the kitchens, even the servants' quarters. People paid $1 to wander through the house and gawk at how the rich had lived. Past tense. Because everyone understood. The Vanderbilts were finished. The fortune was gone. This house was a museum to a dead era. The reviews were cruel. Journalists described Biltmore as a monument to excess, a tasteless display of wealth while Americans starved. They photographed the golden fixtures and marble bathtubs and wrote scathing articles about inequality. The Vanderbilts became symbols of everything wrong with American capitalism. Hoarders, parasites, a family that had built a palace while workers lived in tenements. The public came to see the house, but also to judge it, to witness the fall of American royalty. And the family could do nothing. They needed the admission fees. Every dollar mattered. The estate was operating at a loss, but the tours reduced the bleeding. Barely. The annual deficit was still crushing. Edith sold more art, paintings that George had collected, sculptures, tapestries. Christie's auctioned them in New York. The catalogues described each piece in loving detail, then sold them to the highest bidder. The house was being gutted, object by object, beauty converted to cash to pay for coal and taxes and the salaries of the few remaining staff. The city of Asheville tried to help. In 1930, civic leaders approached Edith with a proposal. The city would assume some of the estate's debt in exchange for public access. Biltmore would become a regional attraction, a tourist destination that could generate revenue for the entire county. Edith agreed. She had no choice. The alternative was foreclosure, bankruptcy, the complete collapse of the Vanderbilt name. But the city could not save it either. Asheville itself was drowning. The Depression had destroyed the local economy. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment hit 40%. The city took on Biltmore's debt and immediately regretted it. The estate consumed resources faster than tourism could generate them. The roads needed maintenance. The house needed repairs. The forest needed management. Asheville had inherited a financial nightmare. By 1940, the situation was terminal. Edith's remaining fortune was nearly exhausted. The operating costs of Biltmore exceeded $100,000 annually. Tourism generated about $60,000. The deficit was $40,000 per year. Compounding, accelerating. The house was eating what little remained. Edith was 70 years old. Exhausted, she had spent 26 years fighting to keep Biltmore alive. And the house had won. She called a family meeting. Cornelia returned from England, reluctantly. They sat in the library surrounded by books that George had collected. First editions were thousands. That would also be sold. Edith laid out the numbers, the remaining assets, the debts, the annual losses. The conclusion was unavoidable. The money was gone, not all of it. There were still assets. The house itself, the remaining land, art that had not been sold yet, but the liquid capital had evaporated. The fortune that Cornelius Vanderbilt had built, that William had doubled, that George had inherited. It was gone, spent on a house that generated nothing, consumed by marble and fireplaces, and the belief that beauty justified bankruptcy. Cornelia asked the question everyone was thinking, "Can we sell it?" Edith shook her head. They had tried, for years, quietly, through brokers and estate agents and private inquiries. No one wanted Biltmore. A few curiosity seekers toured it, took photographs, then walked away. Because buying the house was only the first cost. Maintaining it was the real nightmare. The heating, the staff, the repairs, the taxes. No individual could afford it. No corporation needed it. The house was unsellable. Then what do we do? Silence. The library echoed with nothing. Outside, tourists walked through the banquet hall, pointed at the pipe organ, took photographs of the fireplace large enough to roast an ox. They paid their $1 and left. And the house remained, beautiful, deadly, waiting. The realization settled over them slowly. They were custodians of a monument they could not afford and could not abandon. The Vanderbilt name was still famous, still recognized. Newspapers still covered their movements. Society pages still tracked their marriages and births and scandals. But the bank accounts were empty. The fortune was a memory. They were famous for being rich. But the wealth was gone. This was the specific moment, the crystallization of collapse. Edith stood up, walked to the window, looked out over the estate that had consumed her husband's life and her daughter's inheritance and her own old age. The forest stretched for miles. The mountains rose in the distance. The view was spectacular. George had chosen this location for its beauty, for the way the light hit the Blue Ridge at sunset, for the isolation that made the house feel like a castle. And that isolation had killed them, because Biltmore was too far from everything that mattered. Too remote to sell, too expensive to maintain, too large to heat, too beautiful to abandon. It was the perfect trap, a golden cage built by a man who believed wealth could purchase immortality. But the Commodore had been right all along. Keep it. Don't let the fools spend it. George had not kept it. He had built a palace, filled it with art and books and furniture imported from Europe, hired an army of servants, entertained kings and presidents and industrialists, and the house had consumed everything. Slowly, steadily, inevitably. The fortune was gone, and the house remained. Edith turned from the window. We keep it open. We sell everything that is not nailed down. And we pray someone finds a use for this place before it buries us completely. Cornelia nodded. She would return to England, leave her mother to manage the collapse. She could not watch anymore. Could not stand in rooms where she had played as a child and see them filled with strangers. Could not bear the humiliation of the Vanderbilt name becoming a punchline, a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you build monuments instead of investing wisely. The meeting ended. They walked through the house in silence, past the tourists, past the closed wings, past the covered furniture and the portraits of ancestors who had warned them this would happen. The Commodore stared down from the wall, his face carved in stone, the man who had built the fortune through brutality and hoarding, who had warned his children not to be fools. And they had ignored him. George had spent half his inheritance on a house. The Depression had consumed the rest. The Vanderbilt fortune, $200 billion in today's money, was gone, evaporated, converted into marble and fireplaces and a French chateau that would outlast the family that built it. The house had won. It always won, because stone lasts longer than flesh, because monuments outlived dynasties, because Biltmore was never a home. It was a tomb, and the Vanderbilts had been buried inside it while still breathing. The tourists kept coming. They walked through the banquet hall, admired the organ, photographed the library, paid their $1 and left. And the house watched, silent, patient, hungry, always hungry. The reunion happened in 1973. Vanderbilt University in Nashville hosted it, a gathering of the descendants. 120 people who carried the name that had once meant power, wealth, dominance. They came from across the country. Teachers, salesmen, middle managers, retirees. They filled a conference hall and looked at each other with a mixture of pride and confusion, because they shared a legacy, a history, a name that still appeared in textbooks, but not a single one was a millionaire. The reporters noticed immediately. This was the story: the fall of American royalty. Journalists interviewed the descendants, asked about their lives, their jobs, their financial situations. The answers were ordinary, comfortable, some said, modest, others admitted. One worked as a librarian, another managed a hardware store, a third was a schoolteacher in Ohio. These were not the heirs to a $200 billion fortune. These were middle-class Americans whose great-great-grandfather had built an empire. And the empire was gone. The math was simple. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 with $100 million, the largest private fortune in American history. Within 3 generations, it had evaporated, spent on houses, parties, art, yachts, the maintenance of a lifestyle that generated nothing. The Vanderbilts had confused wealth with income, believed the money would last forever, that their name entitled them to luxury without labor. The houses killed them. Not just Biltmore, the entire family had built monuments. The Breakers in Newport, Marble House, Idle Hour, mansions that cost millions to construct and millions more to maintain. Each one a statement, proof that the Vanderbilts belonged with European aristocracy. And each one a financial black hole that consumed capital faster than investments could generate returns. But Biltmore was the worst, because George had not just built a house, he had built a cathedral to his own taste. A monument so absurd, so expensive, so completely disconnected from economic reality that it became a case study in how not to manage wealth. He spent $6 million, $200 million in today's money on construction, then bled another $250,000 annually keeping it operational. For what? To impress visitors who stayed a weekend and left? To prove he had culture? The house proved nothing except that excess has consequences. After Edith died in 1958, Biltmore passed to Cornelius' sons, William and George Cecil. They inherited the same trap their grandmother had fought: a house worth millions on paper, worthless in practice. They could not sell it, could not afford to maintain it privately. The only option was commercialization, full, unashamed tourist operation. They opened it completely in 1960. Not just tours, the entire estate became a business. Gift shops, restaurants, a winery, hotel rooms in the converted outbuildings. They marketed Biltmore as America's largest home, a destination, an experience. The descendants of George Vanderbilt became event coordinators, wedding planners, hospitality managers. They were not living in the house, they were running it like a theme park. And it worked. By the 1970s, Biltmore was generating revenue. Real revenue. Hundreds of thousands of visitors annually paying admission fees, buying souvenirs, drinking wine in the estate vineyard. The house that had nearly bankrupted the family was now profitable, but not for the family. The profits went back into maintenance, into staff, into the endless costs of keeping a 250-room chateau operational. The Cecil brothers were not wealthy. They were custodians. They lived comfortably. The estate provided salaries, but they were employees of the house, not owners in any meaningful sense, because Biltmore owned them, dictated their lives, required constant attention. They could not leave, could not sell their stake, could not escape the gravitational pull of the monument their great-grandfather built. This is the moral, the lesson written in marble and limestone. Great houses are not assets, they are parasites. They attach to a fortune and drain it slowly. The maintenance, the taxes, the staff, the repairs, the heating bills that could fund a middle-class family for years. The houses demand everything, and they give nothing back except beauty. Aesthetic pleasure, the satisfaction of owning something magnificent. But beauty does not pay mortgages. Magnificence does not generate dividends. The Commodore understood this. Cornelius Vanderbilt lived in a modest brownstone, wore the same coat for years, hoarded every dollar, because he knew wealth was fragile, that empires collapse, that the only protection against ruin was accumulation. He warned his children, told them not to be fools, not to spend the money on monuments and parties and proving they belonged. They ignored him, and they paid the price. William Vanderbilt built mansions on Fifth Avenue. His children built more, bigger, more expensive, each generation trying to outdo the previous one. The Breakers was larger than anything William built. Biltmore was larger than the Breakers. The competition was internal, familial. Each heir trying to prove they deserved the name by spending the fortune faster. And the fortune could not sustain it, because the Vanderbilt wealth was not infinite. It was large, enormous even, but it was finite. And finite resources cannot support infinite consumption. The houses consumed faster than the investments grew. The parties, the yachts, the art collections, the staff, the travel. Every excess bled capital, and capital, once spent, does not regenerate on its own. By 1973, the money was gone. The descendants at the reunion were not poor. They were comfortable, middle class, the American dream, many would say. But they were not Vanderbilts in the way their ancestors had been. They did not command industries, did not own railroads, did not dictate markets. They were ordinary people with an extraordinary name. And the name meant nothing without the money. The houses outlasted the fortune. Biltmore still stands, larger than ever, more visitors than George could have imagined. The estate attracts over 1 million tourists annually. They pay $30 to walk through rooms where a family bled to death financially. They take photographs of the banquet hall, the library, the bedrooms where Edith lay awake calculating how many years remained before bankruptcy. The tourists see beauty. They do not see the bills. The Breakers is a museum now, owned by the Preservation Society of Newport County, open to the public. The Vanderbilts sold it in 1972 for $365,000, a house that cost $7 million to build in 1895. Sold for less than the cost of a modern suburban home, because the maintenance was unsustainable, because keeping a 70-room mansion operational required fortunes that no longer existed. Marble House, Idle Hour, Vanderbilt mansions across the country, all museums, all public, all monuments to a family that built empires and left nothing to their heirs except cautionary tales. This is what happens when you build monuments instead of businesses. The Commodore built railroads, infrastructure, systems that generated revenue. His fortune grew because it was productive. It created value, moved goods, employed thousands. The railroads were ugly, functional, profitable. They were not beautiful, but they worked. George built a chateau. It was beautiful, magnificent, utterly useless. It generated no revenue, employed people, yes, but only to maintain itself. A circular economy that consumed without producing. The house was a closed system. Money went in, nothing came out except aesthetic pleasure. And aesthetic pleasure does not compound. The stock market compounds. Investments compound. Businesses grow, infrastructure appreciates, but houses decay. They require constant infusions of cash just to remain standing. The moment you stop feeding them, they collapse. Roofs leak, pipes burst, foundations crack. Beauty is expensive, and it never stops being expensive. The Vanderbilts learned this too late. By the time they understood that Biltmore was killing them, the fortune was already gone. They tried to adapt, sold land, liquidated art, cut staff, opened the house to tourists. But these were survival tactics, not solutions. The fundamental problem remained. They owned a house that required a fortune to maintain, and the fortune had been spent building it. The trap was perfect. They could not sell it without humiliation, could not maintain it without bankruptcy, could not abandon it without betraying the family legacy. So they stayed, generation after generation, bleeding slowly, watching the fortune evaporate, becoming custodians of their own tomb, and the house watched them die. Biltmore is still there, still magnificent. The marble still gleams. The carvings are still breathtaking. The dome still echoes. Tourists walk through and marvel at the craftsmanship, the scale, the beauty. They take photographs, buy souvenirs, drink wine from the estate vineyard. Then they leave, and the house remains, waiting for the next family to misunderstand what it means to be wealthy, waiting for the next generation to confuse accumulation with consumption, waiting for someone else to believe that building a monument will cement their legacy. because monuments do not preserve legacies. They consume them. The Vanderbilt name is famous. Every American knows it, recognizes it, associates it with wealth and power and the Gilded Age. But the descendants are not wealthy. They are ordinary. The fortune their great-great-grandfather built is gone, converted into limestone and marble and carved wood, transformed from liquid capital into frozen beauty. And beauty cannot buy groceries. This is the final lesson, the truth that Biltmore teaches with brutal clarity. Houses are not investments. They are expenses. The larger the house, the larger the expense, and past a certain point the expense becomes unsustainable. Biltmore crossed that point before construction finished. George spent himself into a trap, and every generation since has been trying to escape. But you cannot escape a house that weighs 4 acres. The stone is too heavy, the history is too thick, the beauty is too overwhelming. Biltmore is a masterpiece, a triumph of architecture and craftsmanship and artistic vision. It is also a financial weapon that destroyed the family that built it. The descendants understand this now. The Cecils run Biltmore as a business, professionally. They have turned the estate profitable by treating it as a commercial operation, not a home, not a legacy, a product, something that can be sold to tourists and corporate events and weddings. The house has been stripped of its original purpose, no longer a residence, now a venue. And that is the only way it survives, by abandoning the fantasy that houses this large can be lived in, by accepting that monuments require commercialization, that beauty at this scale cannot exist privately. It must be shared, sold, converted into an experience that people pay for. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore to prove they were special. Now strangers walk through it daily, eat lunch in the cafe, get married in the gardens. The house has been democratized, made public. The very thing George was trying to avoid, being ordinary, has become the house's salvation. Biltmore survives by being accessible, by letting anyone with $30 walk through rooms that were designed for exclusivity. The irony is suffocating. George spent millions creating a private paradise, a place where he could escape the masses and live surrounded by beauty. And the only way to keep that paradise standing is to invite the masses in, to charge them admission, to let them photograph the library and the bedrooms and the banquet hall, to sell souvenirs in the gift shop, to commercialize every square foot. The house defeated him, completely, totally. And it will defeat the next owner too, and the one after that, because Biltmore cannot be owned. Not really. You can hold the deed, pay the taxes, employ the staff, but the house owns you, dictates your decisions, consumes your resources, demands your constant attention. This is the horror of great houses. They are beautiful, magnificent, breathtaking, and they are vampires. They drain you slowly, so slowly you do not notice until it is too late, until the fortune is gone, until your descendants are gathering at university reunions wondering what happened to the money. The money is in the walls, in the marble floors and carved ceilings and imported chandeliers. It has been converted from liquid wealth into frozen beauty. And frozen beauty cannot be spent, cannot be invested, cannot compound. It can only sit there, gorgeous, useless. A monument to the belief that houses are assets. They are not. Houses are liabilities. The larger the house, the larger the liability. And Biltmore is the largest house in America, which makes it the largest liability ever constructed by a private family. The Commodore built an empire of steel and steam. His heirs became tour guides. That is the Vanderbilt legacy. Not the fortune, not the railroads, not the industrial dominance. Just a house. A massive, beautiful, deadly house that consumed everything and gave nothing back. Stand in the banquet hall today. Look up at the 70-foot ceiling. Listen to the echoes. Feel the cold that never quite leaves. And understand, you are standing inside a tomb, a monument to the delusion that money can buy permanence. That beauty justifies bankruptcy. That houses are investments. They are not. They are parasites. And Biltmore is still feeding.